Welcome to the second part of the course, Classroom-Based Assessment. After this session, you will be able to compare formal assessment and informal classroom-based assessment, use a range of techniques to assess language and skills in learners, choose, adapt, and create classroom-based assessment tasks. If we are talking about young learners, they are still developing physically, emotionally, and cognitively. They may not understand the idea of taking exams or having enough language for you to assess. Older learners may worry about having to pass exams. There can be many good reasons why tests are part of everyday school life for learners and teachers. For example, to keep a record of a progress, to inform parents, and to help learners to prepare for future exams. It is important to motivate students and encourage them to want to practice English. Making testing and assessment fun is one way of doing it. It can also help teachers to test in the same ways as they teach. Talking about classroom-based assessment, we can compare it to formal, summative assessment, and here are the main differences. Classroom-based assessment is sometimes called informal assessment. It is usually done regularly, so it is ongoing. Learners can have help from their teacher or other learners. Learners do this under normal classroom conditions with typical classroom activities. Formal assessment, as we already studied in part 1, is usually done at the end of period of learning, includes tests and exams, is done by learners individually without any help, is usually for a grade score to measure achievement. The reasons for using classroom-based assessment are: learners are familiar with activities so they can focus on language. Learners may feel less nervous than informal test. It is a more valid way to test learners and it is also fairer. Learners develop at different rates and teachers can consider these differences. Learners develop at different rates and teacher can focus on progress instead of achievement. Dear colleagues, ask yourself these questions about how do you assess your learners. How old are your learners? How many learners are there in your classes? How often do your learners do a formal assessment? More than once a month, once a term, once a year, or never? How often do you do classroom-based assessments with your learners? What do you assess in classroom-based assessment? Non-linguistic factors, behavior, attendance? Yes, no? If yes, which ones? Linguistic factors? If yes, which ones? What techniques do you use for classroom-based assessment? Make some notes. Think about this. As for techniques for informal classroom-based assessment, they include using the criteria that are the same for all learners, observing the learners and making notes, assessing a few learners at a time, using criteria to mark work and the records to show where learners are improving. To assess speaking skills, you can observe learners as they do regular speaking activities in the class. To assess listening skills, you can observe how learners respond to classroom language. To assess speaking skills, you can observe also how learners use classroom language. You may keep a record of marks you give learners for homework. You and the learners may decide the words for the next test together. Why not? The learners can correct each other's vocabulary tests. You may observe students during reading and listening activities. You may collect the learners' work and make a note of the marks. You may assess small groups of learners at different times. Also, you may use peer correction for reading and listening activities. Here are some examples of assessment techniques. When my learners do a speaking activity in pairs, I listen to 2 or 3 pairs while they do the activity. Then I make notes in my class notebook about their strengths and weaknesses. Sometimes when my learners do reading and listening activities, I ask them to swap books and mark each other's work. Then I collect 5 or 6 books to look at and make notes on. I sometimes do this for writing tasks too. As for the materials for informal classroom-based assessment, so they can be the usual workbook, the teacher's book, or even the internet. Benefits and challenges of the resources. If we are using progress tests from the teacher's book, they assess the language and skills learners have done in class. They have texts with the right length. They are easy for the teacher to mark, and even learners can mark them if they are simple. If we are using resources from the internet, of course there are a lot of materials available, but teachers need to choose materials carefully. Sometimes teachers may need to shorten the texts, or sometimes teachers may need to change vocabulary. If we are using workbook activities, they are very useful for revision and review. Also, we can mark, students can mark each other's exercises by themselves. Let's discuss some practical examples. My course book doesn't include any assessment material for informal use in the classroom. I thought about reusing activities from the course book, or maybe the workbook. I am worried that this won't be a valid assessment. Is it a good idea? And is the assessment still valid? Yes, it is a valid assessment, and learners are unlikely to remember the answers. Even if they did, they are likely to learn something better if they repeat it. So, please, for your assessment, use even exercises from the course books that already are done. Yes, it is valid. You will be assessing learners on what way they have learned in the class, and in the way that they have learned it. Yes, it's a good idea. You can make clean copies of the activities to give to the learners, or you can write them on the board. You could even dictate questions, perhaps. Another situation. I looked online for a text to use for a classroom-based reading assessment, and I found some texts about animals that my learners might find interesting. What else should I think about when I choose texts for the assessment? Okay, you need to think about the type of the text to check it is similar to the text your learners are familiar with or not. You need to think about the level of the text, including the vocabulary, grammar, and the content. You need to think about how long the text is, and if you can shorten it to make it more suitable. Now let us summarize. For successful classroom-based assessment, teachers can use ongoing assessment activities to get continuous feedback on how learners are progressing. Use familiar classroom activities. Support learners with teacher or peer feedback. Include non-linguistic areas in the assessment. Add motivation and fun to the process by involving all the learners in creating assessment tasks. Ask all the learners to peer assess each other's work. Techniques for informal classroom-based assessment in small and larger classes include: for speaking tasks, make notes on 3 or 4 pairs or 1 or 2 small groups each lesson, so you observe all learners over a series of lessons. Writing tasks, collect written tasks from different learners over a series of lessons and record your comments. Reading and listening tasks. Observe and make notes on different learners each time you do a reading or listening lesson. Listen to a few pairs of learners during speaking activities and note how they participate, for example, by identifying words on flashcards. Use linguistic or non-linguistic criteria to help write your notes, for example, range of vocabulary and accuracy of spelling, attitude and behavior. Review notes at the end of a term year to check learners' progress. As for the sources of materials for classroom-based assessment, we can use progress tests from your course book, the teacher's book, or the workbook. We can reuse an exercises that you have already done in class with learners as an assessment task. Adapt a listening or reading exercise that you have done in class with learners, for example, by writing some new questions. We can use similar tasks or texts types from course books that are the same level as your learners. We can use the internet to find suitable materials, for example, similar tasks or text types, topics, but adapt as necessary. We can involve all the learners in writing assessment tasks for their peers with your help. Thank you for participation in the course.